As I was getting ready to leave the gym one evening, the familiar sounds of weights clinking and muffled grunts gradually faded into the background. My mind was already on the errands waiting for me at home. Then, suddenly, a sharp thud snapped me out of my thoughts. I turned around, and there he was, a young man sprawled awkwardly next to the dumbbells, his expression a mix of surprise and embarrassment. Without thinking, I quickly approached and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" I asked. He looked up at me, offering a sheepish grin and a nod. His dark hair was slightly tousled from the fall. "Yeah, I think so. Just a little clumsy today," he laughed. It was that easy, carefree laugh that made me smile in return. A strange warmth spread through me. This certainly wasn't how I had imagined spending my evening. Yet, in that brief, almost accidental moment, everything around us seemed to slow down. For a second, I forgot where I was, lost in the simplicity of the moment, just him and me. Our eyes locked in a way that felt too intense for two strangers in a crowded gym. He dusted his hands off and stood up, his tall frame towering slightly over mine, though he didn't seem to notice. "Thanks for that," he said, his voice quiet but grounding, as though he was careful not to disrupt the invisible boundary that had suddenly formed between us. I nodded, trying to shake off the strange feeling tugging at me, reminding myself that he was just a stranger. Just a fleeting encounter. "I'm just glad you're okay," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Internally, I was berating myself. What was I doing? I was a grown woman, a married woman, here to work out, to escape the daily routine for an hour. But now, my heart was racing for reasons I couldn't explain. He thanked me again, then did something unexpected. He reached out as if to shake my hand, but paused, his fingers hovering just shy of mine. It was as though he had second thoughts. We both chuckled awkwardly, and just when I thought the moment had passed, he leaned in. It was so quick, I barely had time to process it, a light brush of his lips against mine. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, my mind screaming in protest. Yet somehow it stayed quiet. I knew it was wrong. I knew it meant nothing. But in that fleeting second, something deep within me cracked open, a feeling I thought I would never experience again. The moment ended almost as quickly as it began. He pulled away, his eyes wide with the same mix of shock and confusion I felt. We both stumbled over our words for a moment before we both just laughed again. This time, it was more uncertain. He looked away, rubbing the back of his neck, clearly trying to hide his own embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I don't know what that was." "I didn't mean to," he stammered. "It's okay," I managed to say, my voice shaking slightly. What more could I say without revealing how shaken I was? I forced myself to look away, scanning the gym as if someone might have seen what just happened. Even though no one was paying the slightest attention, an awkward silence settled between us, lasting what felt like forever. I took a deep breath, straightened up, and nodded, unsure of what I was agreeing to. "You know what? Don't worry about it," I said, trying to sound casual, though I knew it came across as forced. I wanted to sound like this was just another normal moment, but it felt anything but. He met my eyes again, his expression holding a mix of curiosity and regret. Before I could figure it out, he quickly turned away, mumbling, "I should go. I'll let you finish your workout. Thanks again for helping." He was gone before I could say anything else, leaving me standing there, alone, with my mind a chaotic jumble of emotions I hadn't expected and certainly hadn't wanted. As I walked out of the gym, I felt as though I was in a daze, replaying those few seconds over and over. My husband's face flashed in my mind, and guilt surged in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, just a silly accident. But as I made my way to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted within me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. After that night, I promised myself to forget the whole thing, just a silly accident, nothing more. I went to the gym the next day, determined to shake off whatever strange thrill had taken hold of me. But the moment I walked in and saw him, every promise I'd made to myself shattered. He was already there, lifting weights in the far corner, his focus solely on the rhythm of his movements. I should have turned around and found another part of the gym, but instead, my feet carried me closer. The closer I got, the more I noticed the little things, the steady rise and fall of his breath, the slight furrow in his brow as he concentrated. I had to stop myself from staring, from letting my gaze linger too long. There was no reason to approach him. Yet I felt a pull toward him, like a magnet. I took a spot on a nearby treadmill, pretending to adjust my water bottle, sneaking glances when I thought he wouldn't notice. But then he turned. Our eyes met for just a moment, and he smiled. Not the awkward, uncertain smile from the night before, but something warmer, friendlier. I couldn't help but smile back, even as my heart raced. I busied myself with the treadmill, reminding myself to breathe. But after a few moments, he came over, casually leaning against the railing of the treadmill beside mine. "Hey," he said, his voice easy, his posture relaxed, as if we were old friends. "Hi," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I hoped he didn't notice the way my hands trembled as I adjusted the settings, pretending I hadn't just spent the last few minutes gathering the courage to speak to him. We talked about workout routines, the gym, and a handful of other trivial things. But with each word, I felt myself settling into the conversation, as though talking to him was the most natural thing in the world. I'd laugh at something he said, and he'd look at me, really look at me, as though seeing something no one else did. And I could feel it, the same quiet pull from the night before drawing us closer. I should have seen it coming. I should have set some boundaries from the start. But every time I tried, his presence seemed to dismantle any wall I put up without effort. When the conversation began to slow, he hesitated, glancing at his feet before looking back up at me, his eyes serious. "Hey, about last night," he started, his voice quieter. He didn't need to finish. I knew exactly where he was going, and I wasn't sure I was ready to go there. Yet, there we stood, suspended between our unspoken words, both of us trapped in that unaddressed tension. "I get it," I said, trying to make it sound like it was no big deal, though I knew it was anything but. He nodded thoughtfully, his gaze lingering on me, a silent question in his eyes, one that neither of us seemed ready to voice. In that moment, his hand shifted slightly, brushing against mine as he leaned back, and my pulse jumped. It was a fleeting touch, but it was enough to send a rush of something electric through me, that same magnetic pull that had drawn us together before. He pulled his hand away quickly, both of us seeming just as shaken by the touch. For a brief second, we stood there in silence. The gym was nearly empty, the only sound the soft hum of machines around us. And in that stillness, it felt like we were the only two people left in the world. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice hesitant. "I guess I'll see you around," he said, almost as though he didn't want to leave. I nodded automatically, but inside, I felt a pull to stay connected, even though everything in me screamed to step back, to stay away. But I couldn't. There was something here, something too strong to ignore. "Yeah, I guess so," I replied, my voice soft, and already my thoughts were racing. Would I see him tomorrow? Would this strange connection continue? He nodded back at me, then turned and walked away without another word. I watched him go, the distance between us growing with every step until he was out of sight. As I finished my workout, I tried to convince myself it was just a passing interaction, nothing more. But as I walked out of the gym, a strange mix of anticipation and unease settled over me. I knew I'd see him again, there was no doubt about that. And despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. On the drive home, I tried to push it from my mind, reminding myself of the commitments I'd made, the life I was supposed to be living. But the memory of his voice, his eyes, and the way his touch lingered refused to fade. Over the next few days, our encounters were brief, just a quick nod or a smile from across the room. But it was clear neither of us could shake the pull. I'd catch him looking at me, and I'd quickly look away, not trusting myself to dwell on the connection that was forming. Then one evening, as I was finishing up, I saw him by the water cooler, giving me a small wave. My heart fluttered before I could stop it, a spark of excitement I couldn't explain. I told myself to keep it casual, to pretend this was just like any other conversation. But when I walked over, I saw something different in his eyes. Something softer. "Hey," he said, almost shyly. "I'm going for a run in the park nearby. Thought you might want to join." His voice was easy, but I could hear the hope there, and it was impossible to ignore. I hesitated, glancing around, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt. But there he was, right in front of me, waiting. Despite the voice in my head telling me to be cautious, I found myself nodding. "Sure, some fresh air sounds good," I said, my voice light, though my heart was pounding. We ran in silence at first, the sound of our feet crunching on the gravel filling the space between us. The cool evening air wrapped around us as we made our way through the nearly deserted park, weaving between the paths while the last rays of sunlight dipped behind the trees. It felt surreal, as if the world had shrunk down to just the two of us. Finally, he spoke, breaking the quiet. "So, you come here often?" he asked with a teasing smile. I couldn't help but laugh. It was such a cheesy line, but it made me relax, the tension lifting from both of us. I caught my breath, smiling back. "Actually, no. I've been a bit caught up in other things." My answer was vague, but he seemed to understand, nodding thoughtfully. We stopped at a bench to catch our breath, and he stretched, his shoulders rolling as he looked out at the park. His expression softened, and then he turned to me with a look of curiosity in his eyes. "Sometimes I wonder if this is all there is, the routines, the expectations. Don't you ever feel like there's something more?" I wasn't sure how to respond. His words hit something deep inside me, echoing thoughts I had long buried. I swallowed and nodded slowly.
"Yeah, Ido."
More often than I cared to admit. For a moment, neither of us said anything. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, something raw and real, and I felt my own walls start to crack. This wasn't just some guy from the gym anymore. He was someone who had seen a side of me I hadn't shared in years. The silence hung between us, thick with all the things we weren't saying, all the questions left unanswered. I reached out, my fingers brushing his arm lightly. He glanced down at my hand, then back up at me, his expression shifting. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. There was something else, something warmer, more inviting. And before I could stop myself, before I had time to think about the consequences, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Our lips met, and the world seemed to fade away. It was a gentle kiss, not rushed, not frantic, just a quiet connection that spoke louder than anything we could have said. I felt his hand on my shoulder, steadying me, like we were both standing on the edge of something thrilling and dangerous. When we finally pulled back, we just looked at each other, the weight of what had just happened settling in. He cleared his throat, his voice a soft whisper. "I didn't expect that," he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips, though his eyes were serious. "Neither did I replied, feeling a mix of exhilaration and fear. I knew I should leave, walk away before things went any further. But I couldn't make myself move. Not yet. We sat there for a while, the silence between us almost comforting, almost like it was meant to be. But as the minutes passed, reality crept back in, the weight of what we had just done pressing on me. I glanced away, biting my lip. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea," I muttered, mostly to myself. He didn't answer right away, just watched me, his gaze unreadable. After a moment, he sighed, a soft sound that seemed to carry all the unspoken weight between us. "You're probably right," he said quietly. "But there's something about this, something I can't ignore." His words landed harder than I expected, a strange combination of relief and sorrow twisting inside me. I wanted to believe him, to think this connection could mean something more, that it could exist outside of the confines of this moment. But the truth was, it wasn't that simple. I had a life, commitments, responsibilities. And no matter how badly I wished otherwise, those things couldn't be dismissed. I forced myself to stand, feeling the chill of the evening air creep over me. "We should go," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. He nodded without protest, standing next to me as we started walking back to the gym. There was still that lingering tension between us, a silence full of everything neither of us dared to say. I felt his eyes on me, but I kept my focus ahead, reminding myself of the boundaries I was trying to maintain. I had to be strong. I had to stay in control. But as we reached the parking lot and exchanged our goodbyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever this was between us, I wasn't prepared for it. In the days that followed, I tried to slip back into my normal routine, to act like everything was fine. But it wasn't. The memory of that evening, of the soft, unexpected kiss, haunted me, tucked away like a secret I couldn't forget. Every time I saw him at the gym, it was as if an invisible thread pulled me toward him. It was delicate, almost fragile, but undeniable. I couldn't shake it. But he kept his distance, honoring the boundaries I'd tried to set that night. Still, every glance we exchanged carried so much more than words could express, emotions neither of us seemed brave enough to confront. Then one evening, just as I was about to leave, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to find him standing there, his expression hesitant yet warm. "Hey," he said, his tone almost too casual, as if he'd rehearsed this moment in his mind. "Hey," I responded, my voice betraying none of the nervous energy coursing through me. "I know," he started, his voice trailing off as he looked down before meeting my gaze again, more focused. "I think we should talk. No pressure. Just a conversation."
I didn't know what to say.
The rational side of me screamed to walk away, to leave things as they were. But there was something in his look, something in the quiet sincerity that softened my resistance. Before I knew it, I was nodding. "All right,
Just talking.
he suggested a small cafe a few blocks away, far enough from the gym where we wouldn't risk being seen. It was one of those unremarkable spots, dimly lit, with booths that offered a sense of privacy. We sat in a quiet corner, the hum of distant conversations filling the air as we avoided looking at each other for a few moments. Neither of us knew where to begin. "So, I guess this is kind of strange," he said with a small, nervous smile. I chuckled, trying to relax, and nodded. "You could say that." He exhaled, his expression turning more serious. "I know this can't go anywhere, I really do. I know there are boundaries, things we both have to respect. And I'm not trying to push anything on you. I don't know how to explain it. When I'm around you, I feel like I can be myself, like you see parts of me I didn't even know were there. I don't know if that even makes sense." His words hit deeper than I expected, stirring something in me I had been trying to avoid. I looked down at my coffee cup, playing with the handle as I took in what he said. "It makes sense. More than you know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. For the next hour, we talked about anything and everything. Nothing about the gym or our ordinary lives. It was as if we existed only in that moment. He shared his dream of becoming a photographer, the way he viewed the world through different lenses, how every flicker of light and shadow told a story. I spoke of things from my past, memories of a life I almost forgot I wanted. It was like peeling back layers of myself I'd buried long ago. Youth, lost ambitions, a life I once thought I would lead. Time seemed irrelevant in that small cafe, and he listened like he truly saw me, like he cared in a way that no one had in years. As he spoke, I found myself leaning in, drawn to the sincerity in his words, to the passion in his voice. I realized with a mix of fear and relief that I didn't want this night to end. But reality was never far behind. The clock on the wall reminded me of the life waiting for me, of the promises I'd made, and the responsibilities I couldn't ignore. I looked down at my hands, feeling the weight of all those quiet truths pressing on me. "I should go," I said, the sadness in my voice slipping through despite my best efforts. He nodded, understanding, but there was a trace of disappointment in his eyes.
"Yeah."
"Of course." As we stood to leave, he reached out, hesitated for a moment, then quickly dropped his hand back to his side. Part of me wished he hadn't pulled away, that he would have kept it there, giving me a reason to stay longer, just a little longer. But we both knew this couldn't last. Not like this. We walked out into the cold evening air, both of us feeling the weight of what had just happened, but neither of us saying it. I wrapped my jacket tighter around myself, stealing one last glance at him, trying to memorize the way his face looked in the dim light, the way the shadows played across his features. I wanted to say something, anything to break the thick silence between us. But I couldn't. "Good night," he murmured softly. "Good night," I replied, barely able to hear my own voice. I knew that I was leaving more behind than just a conversation. I turned and walked toward my car, the space between us growing with every step. The silence was deafening. As I drove home, my mind raced, tangled in a mess of emotions. Part of me regretted letting things get this close, but another part, the part one hadn't listened to in a long time, felt alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. And that terrified me more than anything. When I got home, my husband was still up, watching TV. He glanced up when I walked in, a question in his eyes. "You're home late," he remarked, his tone neutral, but there was an edge to it, something I couldn't quite place. I forced a smile, nodding as I answered. "Yeah, just got caught up after the gym." He nodded, accepting my explanation, but his gaze lingered on me a moment longer than usual. I felt a knot of guilt tighten in my stomach, the weight of the evening pressing down on me. I excused myself, retreating to the bedroom, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts, of feelings I couldn't name, of a connection that felt both impossible and undeniable. As I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of him. The warmth in his eyes, the quiet understanding between us that seemed to transcend words. It was like he'd held up a mirror, showing me a part of myself I hadn't recognized in years. And even though I knew that nothing good could come of this, even though I knew I had to walk away, I found myself holding on to the memory of that night. The conversation. That brief, fragile feeling of belonging. But deep down, I knew that with every meeting, every conversation, I was being drawn deeper into something I wasn't sure I could control. Something that would eventually ask more of me than I was willing to give. Each encounter after that felt more dangerous, like we were balancing on the edge of something I couldn't turn back from. I kept telling myself to stop, to end whatever this was before it became too much. But every time I tried, every time I made an effort to distance myself, I found myself being pulled back in. We were still just talking, just stealing moments, brief snippets of peace in the midst of the chaos of our lives. But I knew, deep down, that with every smile exchanged, every word shared, I was edging closer to a line I couldn't afford to cross. Then one afternoon, as I was gathering my things to leave the gym, I found a folded note tucked into my bag. My heart skipped a beat as I quickly glanced around, making sure no one was watching before unfolding it. The note was short, written in his familiar handwriting. A simple message: "Meet me at the pier tonight." I stood there, the note trembling in my hand. A mix of excitement and dread flooded over me. I knew I shouldn't go. I knew that meeting him outside the safe boundaries of the gym was a bad idea. But even as the thoughts raced through my mind, a part of me had already made the decision. I couldn't ignore it. The rest of the day passed in a blur, and by the time evening came, I found myself standing at the edge of the pier. My breath caught when I saw him waiting for me, standing at the water's edge, his back to me. The pier was nearly empty, lit only by the faint glow of streetlights. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. But then he turned, catching sight of me, and smiled. A smile so full of relief and warmth that all my doubts melted away. "Hey," he said softly as I walked toward him. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. "Hey," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. We stood there for a moment, the quiet of the night stretching out between us. There was so much we weren't saying, so many things hanging in the air. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. "Neither was I said, trying to keep my tone light, though the tension between us was thick enough to feel. "But here I am." He nodded, glancing down before meeting my gaze again. "I just wanted to talk. To really talk, without having to look over our shoulders." I didn't respond, but I understood what he meant. Every interaction, every look we shared, had been filled with secrecy, like we were trying to hide something that couldn't be hidden. But here, on this quiet pier, it felt like we could finally be honest with each other. If only for a moment. We began walking along the edge of the pier, the sound of the water lapping softly against the wood filling the space between us. He spoke of his dreams, his desire to travel, to capture moments through his camera that no one else could see. I listened, captivated, the ache in my chest growing as he painted a picture of a life so different from mine, a life filled with passion, with purpose. In return, I shared fragments of myself, memories and dreams I'd kept hidden for so long. There, under the stars, it felt easy to pretend that we were just two people, free of the responsibilities and expectations that weighed us down. That we weren't bound by the lives we had built before this moment. Eventually, we found a bench at the edge of the pier and sat, the quiet stretching between us as we both gazed out over the dark water. His shoulder brushed against mine, a light, accidental touch that made my heart race. I knew I should pull away, should create some space before this went too far, before it became too real. But I couldn't make myself move. It felt too natural. After a long pause, he turned to me, his expression serious. "I know this can't last," he said quietly. His words hit me with a rawness I wasn't prepared for. "I know that sooner or later, we'll have to stop. But I can't stop thinking about you." The truth in his voice landed like a punch to my chest. I felt my resolve falter. "I know," I whispered, barely able to hear my own voice. "It's the same for me." He hesitated for a moment, as though he was wrestling with his own thoughts. Then, he reached out, his hand hovering near mine for a split second before finally resting on top of it. His touch was warm, steady. I felt a rush of emotions I hadn't let myself feel in years. In that moment, it was like everything I had been holding back, all the unspoken words, all the feelings I'd buried, came flooding to the surface. I looked down at our hands, the weight of the moment settling over me. Finally, I forced myself to speak. "We have to be careful," I murmured, more to myself than to him. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I know. And I'll respect whatever you decide. But I needed you to know how I feel." There was a strange comfort in his honesty, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this, even though I knew we were walking a dangerous path. The night wore on, the air growing cooler as we sat in silence, each lost in our thoughts. Eventually, I glanced at my watch, realizing how late it had gotten. "I should go," I said softly, my voice thick with reluctance. He nodded, his face clouded with sadness but accepting. "Yeah, I understand." We lingered for a moment, neither of us ready to break the fragile bond we had formed. Finally, he stepped back, offering me a small, bittersweet smile. "Take care," he said softly. I nodded, the weight of his words settling heavily on me, and turned to leave. But just as I took a few steps, I heard him call out to me. His voice was quiet but urgent. I turned, my heart racing, and he closed the distance between us. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "Just one more thing," he murmured, barely audible. He leaned in, and before I could process what was happening, his lips brushed mine. It was a soft, lingering kiss that carried everything we hadn't said, everything we hadn't dared to express. It lasted just a second, but it felt like a lifetime, like a promise and a goodbye all at once. When he pulled back, we stood there breathless, the weight of the moment hanging between us. He gave me a small, sad smile, and I knew then, this was goodbye, at least for now. Without another word, I turned and walked away, the emptiness in my chest growing with each step. The drive home was a blur. My mind was filled with images of that night, his touch, his words, the way he'd looked at me. I knew it couldn't last. I knew this path led nowhere. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling of something slipping through my fingers, something beautiful, fleeting, and irretrievable. In the days that followed, I buried myself in the routine of daily life, as if I could outrun the memories. I told myself that if I stayed busy enough, I could forget. My husband hardly noticed the change. He was wrapped up in his work and his own world, just like always. We had become experts at moving around each other without ever truly connecting. Two people sharing a space, a life, but not much else. I tried to convince myself that was enough. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. And the memory of that night lingered, turning everything hollow. I thought I'd be able to move on. I thought I could treat it as a passing distraction, a secret I'd carry alone. But even in the quietest moments, while cooking dinner or folding laundry, I found myself drifting back to him, hearing his voice, feeling his touch, wondering if he thought of me too. I found myself waiting for something, a message, a sign, anything to pull me back to him. And the waiting, the silence, only made the ache worse. One evening, after another quiet dinner with my husband, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The air was crisp, with the first hints of autumn settling in. As I wandered through the streets, my thoughts swirled with questions I hadn't dared to face. Was I really willing to live the rest of my life like this? Bound to a life that had become more of an obligation than a choice. I didn't know if I was ready to make any changes. But I knew one thing for certain. Something had to give. As I neared our house, I noticed a car parked a little ways down the street, one I didn't recognize. A sense of familiarity stirred in me, but I brushed it off, assuming it was nothing. Yet, as I got closer, I saw a familiar silhouette leaning against the car, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the street. My heart skipped a beat. It was him. For a moment, I froze, caught between the shock of seeing him there and the rush of emotions that came with it. His eyes met mine, and I saw the same uncertainty mirrored in his gaze. I walked toward him, each step heavier than the last, weighed down by everything I'd tried to bury. What are you doing here? I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. He looked down, his expression troubled. I wasn't sure if I should come. I thought maybe I should just stay away, but I couldn't stop thinking about you. About everything we talked about. I know it's probably wrong, but I had to see you. Had to know if you feel the same. The words hung between us, heavy and raw. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came. The walls I'd built, the defenses I'd carefully constructed, began to crumble. I couldn't deny it. I felt the same. His presence here filled the emptiness I'd been running from. But before I could speak, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw my husband standing there, watching us. His expression unreadable. A cold rush of panic flooded through me. I hadn't heard him come outside. I hadn't noticed him following me. There was a silence that felt like the world had come to a stop. My husband's gaze shifted between the two of us, a mixture of confusion and something darker, something I couldn't place. And in that moment I realized he knew. Without a word, he understood everything. The weight of my choices, of all the things I'd tried to keep hidden, hit me like a freight train. His voice, low and steady, but full of a sadness I hadn't heard in years, cut through the silence. I knew something was going on. I just didn't want to believe it, he said, his words quiet but sharp. I opened my mouth to offer an explanation, but nothing came out. The truth was there, laid bare between us. I couldn't take it back. There was no going back now. He looked at the young man, his face unreadable, then back at me. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. Instead, he just nodded, a small, resigned movement, as though he'd known all along, waiting for me to confirm it. Without a word, he turned and walked back toward the house, his shoulders slumped, his figure smaller than I had ever seen it. I watched him go, feeling a sharp ache settle in my chest. Guilt, grief, and something else, something I couldn't name, flooded me. I looked back at the young man, the person who had stirred something inside me that I thought was long dead. But now, with everything crashing down around me, I realized that it wasn't that simple. The reality was heavier, sharper, more painful than I ever anticipated. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out as if to comfort me. But I shook my head, stepping back. I don't know what I'm doing, I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. The weight of my choices hung in the air between us. He looked at me, a mixture of sadness and understanding in his eyes. I didn't mean to make things harder for you, he said quietly. I thought maybe there was a chance for something real. But maybe I was wrong. I felt tears prickle at the corners of my eyes, the gravity of his words sinking in. Here we were, two people caught in something we couldn't control, something we hadn't fully understood. For a moment, I thought this connection, this fleeting moment of something real, could fill the emptiness. But now, standing here in the wreckage of everything I'd created, I realized that nothing was that simple. He looked at me one last time, as though searching for an answer, a promise, a way forward. But I had nothing left to give. I watched him turn, climb into his car, and drive away, disappearing into the night. Alone in the darkness, the weight of my choices settled over me, suffocating in its finality. A hollow ache bloomed in my chest, an emptiness that no longer seemed possible to fill. I had lost something I hadn't even realized mattered until it was too late. As I turned toward the house, the lights still on in the distance, I knew. The life I had known was gone. It was fractured, and there was no way to put it back together. And as I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more uncertain, a new chapter filled with questions I wasn't sure I could ever answer.